And it's a pleasure to announce the last part for today workshop with organizer Nurzaki. Rejections on IPARTheory, an interview with Professor Ronald Rohner. We will just put chairs. The floor is yours. You have water.
Is it working?
Yeah. You don't need to do anything.
Okay, perfect. Shall we start? It is such an honor to be here today in this conference, and it is an even bigger honor for me to be interviewing Professor Rohner today. I had the pleasure and the privilege to interview him last July for my book chapter in the Global Perspectives of IPARTheory, and I'm very happy that we get to do this again with an audience, and it's going to be recorded. I have to give credit for David Rising and Samleen Ali, who were part of the preparation for this interview. I'm sure they would have loved to be with us, but I'm sure they will be watching the recording. The rationale for this interview is basically to give Professor Rohner the opportunity to tell some very inspiring stories about the development of IPARTheory, and for us to get a sense of not just the professional aspect of the theory, but also its personal relevance to Iran. Professor Rohner is such an inspiration in the field, and it is, again, a great honor to be interviewing you today. So let me give brief bio. By brief, I mean extremely inspiring and exceptional. So Professor Ronald Rohner is Professor Emeritus of Human Development and Family Sciences and of Anthropology at the University of Connecticut. There, he's the director of the Ronald and Nancy Rohner for the study of interpersonal acceptance and rejection. He's also executive director, co-founder, and former president of the International Society for Interpersonal Acceptance and Rejection. In 2004, he received the APA Award for distinguished contributions to the international advancement of psychology. Later, he received the Outstanding International Psychologist Award from the USA and the Henry David International Mentoring Award. Most recently, he was awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Society for Cross-Cultural Research. His career has been devoted to 6.5 decades of international research and collaborations related to parental acceptance rejection. More recently, his work expanded to include interpersonal acceptance rejection as well. One of his greatest sources of satisfaction over the course of his career include helping students and other colleagues achieve their own research and professional goals. Now, at the age of 89, he spends a significant part of most of his days mentoring younger colleagues within the USA and internationally. So, a round of applause, first of all. I have to say that's a very brief summary of the bio. It's much longer and very, very impressive. So let's start with the first question, Ron. How did you first got interested in the study of parental acceptance rejection?
I'm going to tell you some stories. Can you hear me without this?
No.
Okay, I'm going to tell you some stories. There are always stories about everything. We all have our own stories. Mine begins, I'm going to begin at the beginning, as it were. As a kid, very young child. I was born and raised in a Army family, military family. My dad was a career officer during World War II and prior to that. So every 6 months we would move to a different town, a different state, and I went from one school to another school, and I had no sense of stability in my life except my mother. And I adored her, and she adored me. But that was the only thing that was stable in my life. I didn't really know my father very well while he was in the military, because he was always gone, except on a few occasions when we lived in Colorado, and he would take me up high into the Rocky Mountains, and we would put up our tent, a small fire, and then at night, the only thing you could see were the clouds, not the clouds, the stars, and the moon. My father used to be a bit of a philosopher, and he would sit there gazing at her firmament around us and say, someday, son, people are going to be up there, they're going to be walking on that, referring to the moon. And he would tell that to other people, and they would say, President Rohner, you're crazy. No one's ever going to get up there, and that's nonsense. But the way he was talking about it for my 8-year-old, 9-year-old ears, I was fascinated with it. So I wanted to know more about the universe. I couldn't find what I was looking for in the libraries, because I always wound up in astronomy, and they were just telling me factual things, not the philosophical things that I was learning from my father. So I had love for my mother and development of fascination with things around me from my father. A few years went by, age 14. One night I was sitting in a movie theater. Beside me, a man stood up, lurched out into the aisle, dropped down, and I heard death rattles, and he died. That was my first experience with death, and that moved me enormously. I had never seen that before or experienced that. So on my way home, walking that night, on my way home, it started me thinking not just about the universe, but about what does life mean? I was a 14-year-old boy now. What does it mean? What does life mean? What does death mean? Who am I? Where do I fit into this scheme? And then about 2 weeks later, one of my classmates, we were living in a small fishing village at that time in Southern Oregon in the United States. And one of my school friends was out fishing with his dad. And apparently he got a cramp, and his dad tried to jump in after him to pull him out of the water. Both of them drowned. So all the boys and the men in the community were called to the lake. And we had grappling hooks with rowboats. And we were going along the bottom of the lake trying to find their bodies. It turns out that my friend's body had already been found just prior to when we got there. And I found him, they had placed him underneath a shaded tree. And he was lying there with his knees up, and he had almost a smile on his face. And he looked, and his eyes were closed. They had closed them for him. And he looked like if I shook him, I could wake him up and he would start making jokes again, the way he always did. And so again, this was on top of the death that I had experienced a couple of weeks earlier. It was a profound experience for me, shifting my vision somewhat away from the nature of the universe to human behavior. Who are we? What does it mean? What is life itself? Who am I? Thoughts that we've all had about our own existence, probably. Okay, the years went by. After I graduated from high school, I spent 2 years in the Army. was reading everything that I could find and knew about in those days in psychology and in philosophy and philosophical kinds of things. But the psychology, I didn't know anything about academic psychology. So I was reading people like Freud and things like that. Anything I could get my hands, and also spiritual things, religious things. I read the Bible. I was just reading all kinds of things that I could. I spent 2 years in school in the Army, and then they sent me off to United States Military Academy, or what's better known as West Point in the United States. It turns out that that was the biggest mistake I've ever made in my life, to go there. The place was, at that time, was emotionally abusive in every respect of the word. But worst of all for me, I discovered that the program, academic program, was in engineering. And I had no interest and no talent for engineering, but I wasn't yet 21, I was just 20 by this time. So I had to write to my dad, my parents, and say, Dad, this is the wrong place for me. I don't belong here. And he would write back and say, son, you're just having adjustment problems. Just hang in there, it's going to be okay. I'd write back, Dad, by the way, right, this is mail. It would take, several days to get there and him to respond. Computers didn't exist. Airplanes, well, anyway, there you go. The world was a very different world. This was now in 1955. So eventually he realized that I was serious, that I couldn't stay in that place. It was just the wrong place for me. So I went off to the University of Oregon, because I'm an Oregonian by legacy, you might say. My ancestors came out on covered wagons and helped to settle the state of Oregon around the time it became a state in the 1800s. So I think of myself as an Oregonian. I went to the University of Oregon and I took psychology major. So now for the first time, I learned something about academic psychology. So psychology, but I also wanted to be able to put it in a context, so I minored in sociology. And then my last year, I took a course in anthropology. I'd never heard of anthropology before, but I found it really very interesting. But psychology was my love. But I went through school in 3 years. I was 2 years older than all the other students, so I felt like I was in a bit of a hurry because I knew I wanted to go and get a PhD in psychology. And I got married during all of this. By the time I graduated in 1958, I knew that I wanted to go on for a PhD, but I just couldn't do it right away. So I wanted to take a year off. Well, my former father-in-law is a professor of law at a university in Oregon, and one of his students was the best friend of the attaché of the embassy in Morocco. Somebody knew somebody who eventually knew the director of the American School of Tangier. And it turns out that they needed an American couple to teach in the school and also to become the directors of the dormitory of the Moroccan, 14 of the politically elite children of Morocco. So the dormitory that we lived in was the former summer palace of the former Sultan of Morocco. You can imagine it was quite an elegant building. And in the building we had a Moroccan woman who spoke no English, a very fundamental Muslim woman who spoke no English. I spoke no Arabic. I had enough money to get to Europe the summer before classes began, so I bought my wife and I bought a small motorcycle, traveled around Europe, and went to Morocco. The director of the school told us the first week you have a choice. Either get rid of the motorcycle or you don't have a job. So that was beginning of sort of that kind of attitude. Well, the important thing, though, was in the dormitory, Mrs. Abdul Wahab, remember that name? She changed my life. She was by this time I was just a 22-year-old young man, married for a year and a half, 2 years. And Mrs. Abdul Wahab was a devout fundamentalist, Muslim woman, about 50. She was in charge of the maids in the building, and they were Rif tribal women. We had no refrigeration. We did all the cooking on charcoal bristers on the floor. At meals, we would push aside the flies and the dead flies in the hair and whatnot. And our job as American, according to the director of the school, was to put some what he called red, white, and blue. In other words, to teach the Moroccan children, these 14 children of the politically elite, how to use a knife and fork. Because in Morocco, they ate with their hands, off trays of couscous and things like that. And they also had in the dormitory what we often referred to as the Turkish toilets. I don't know where that name comes from because I don't know about it. But anyway, many of you are familiar with them. You walk into a closet, there's a hole in the floor. And there was a spigot there with a tin can, and you would relieve yourself over that hole, and then you would wash yourself, and that would be the toilet tin. For us, they wanted the children to know how to use the European American toilets. So they installed a toilet. About a week after classes began, a very talented, handsome, young 14-year-old Qasim, Mrs. Abdul Wahab asked him, she had learned, she'd never seen a European toilet, an American toilet before, so she had to learn how to use that. She didn't use it, she used the one that was already in the building, but she knew that the children were supposed to be using that. But she asked Qasim, why do they have that white paper in there? What does that do? Well, apparently Qasim took delight in explaining and telling Mrs. Abdul Wahab what toilet paper is used for, and she got the image of European and American people smearing feces all over their backsides and not washing. So we were essentially, in her eyes, defiling her children. And especially I was responsible, because I was the man. And everything was very, very completely genderized. So right away in the first week, Mrs. Abdul Wahab didn't like me, because it was my fault for having the toilet there, for having toilet paper there, for encouraging the children to use it, and so on. And also, she had trouble with the fact that we were teaching them how to use knives and forks. That wasn't the proper way to eat. The proper way to eat is with your hands. So time went on, and I went up into after classes began, we had a weekend off, and I went up into the Rif Mountains. And there was an extraordinarily beautiful mosque up there with mosaics. And I was photographing the mosque. But it turns out just at the moment that I was photographing, the men were coming out after morning prayer. And the kids, the boys, saw me, and they picked up stones and started to throw them at me and yelling in the Rif language. And then the men, I didn't know what they were saying, except I could tell from the behavior and the tone of voice that it wasn't good. The men picked up bigger stones. They were faster and stronger than the boys, and they started throwing. They were going to stone me to death. Fortunately, I was closer to my car than they were. The car took a beating. I only got hit a couple of times, but not on the head, the way that I think that they had hoped. And I was able to flee from that village. What did I do that was wrong? I was asking about this. Well, later on, I was told that there is at that time in Islam, for this particular group of people, thou shalt have no graven images, like no pictures. And they knew what a camera was. So they knew that I was taking pictures, and they assumed that I was taking pictures of the men in violation of their religious and cultural beliefs. But nobody had told me any of this. I didn't know anything about culture. I was a kid from Oregon who had spent 2 years in the Army in New York, and that's all I knew. And all of a sudden, I had Mrs. Abdul-Wahab, who hated me. I had these rich tribal people that didn't like me very much either. They wanted to stone me to death. I went back to the dormitory. A few weeks later, the director of the school, since these were the politically elite children, director wanted to have a feast recognizing the beginnings of the school and the dormitory, and so on. So Mrs. Abdul-Wahab spent a week preparing a feast in traditional Moroccan format. Now, in the dormitory, I call it the dormitory, the Sultan's the palace, we had the Great Hall. And the Great Hall had low cushions all around the walls. And when it came time for the feast, the women were all genderized. The women were all at one end of the building, and the men were at the other. But my former wife was not Moroccan, not Muslim. She wasn't considered a woman. She was a man, so she sat with us. But other than that, there were no women. And then we went through the ritual of washing properly the way it was supposed to be done. And I was all the time watching very carefully what the man next to me was doing and how he did it. Because I didn't have a clue how to behave properly. I really wanted very much to behave properly. And I didn't know how to do it, so I was watching. Okay, I think I can do that. Okay, I saw what he did. So these great platters, brass trays of couscous were brought in by the maids and put in front of us around the Great Hall, and time to eat. So I wasn't sure how to do it, because when I was a kid, if I were to reach in and pick something off the plate with my hands, my mother would slap my hand and say, "Ron, don't do that. It's not nice. You don't eat with your hands. You have a knife and a fork or a spoon, and that's what you do. That's the way you're supposed to do it." So I didn't know how to eat properly, the couscous especially, or rice, with my hands, to ball it up without getting it all down the front of me. I still can't do it very well, by the way. So I reached in, got a mouthful of couscous, and the room went, there was a silence there for a moment. I thought, oh my God, what did I do? Was that me? But then the room livened up again, and people started to talk the way they had been. It's just my imagination. I'm doing it all right. I was doing the same thing that he did. I'm doing it the same way. I'm just being overly sensitive. So I reached in and got another handful of couscous. And Mrs. Abdul-Wahab, who was at the other end of the building, other end of the Great Hall, saw me. She jumped up, shrieking, and fled the room, cursing me. And this time I had no question, it was me. What did I do that caused her to do that? Well, can anybody guess? I'm sure you can. I'm gesturing the way I would eat the couscous. All right, I'm left-handed. And your left hand is for wiping yourself at the toilet. It's a defiled hand. I told Mrs. Abdul Wahab symbolically, Mrs. Abdul Wahab, your feast is shit. I could not have done anything more insulting than to eat publicly on this grand occasion with some of the most important people of Morocco. After she had spent a week developing this feast, I insulted her. And she knew that I did this on purpose. So from that time on, her dislike of me turned to hatred. She despised me. And anything that happened in that dormitory from that moment on was my fault. Event after event after event, Mrs. Abdul Wahab figured in a lot of these to change my life completely. But not all bad things. There were some beautiful things that happened. My former wife and I, at Christmas Eve day, had driven across the high Atlas Mountains in southern Morocco onto the Sahara Desert. And in those days, the French Legion had outposts at day intervals apart, the gîtes d'état. So our goal was to get to that one outpost before they had a gate that comes down, that once the gate is down, it's down until the next day. I don't care who you are. That gate is not going to come back up. So if you want to get there, you get there before the gate comes down. So we knew that. So we were in a bit of a hurry. It was a trek. There was no road, of course. It was just a track. And we had to ford a riverbed, mostly dry. Paused, looked at it. Water was only a couple of inches deep. Okay, I could make it across. So we started to drive across, and I must have gone a little bit too fast. It was very rocky and whatnot. Something happened that I got water. I don't know exactly what it was, but I think it was on the distributor in the car. Anyway, the car stopped in the middle of the river. Okay, here it is, Sahara Desert. And then I noticed, as an hour went by, that the water that had been that deep when we first got there was now that deep. And it was rising because there had been a melt in the high Atlas Mountains. And so the ice, the snow, was coming down the river and filling the river up. Oh my God, what am I going to do now? I've got a car in the middle of the river. I'm in the Sahara Desert. I'm miles away from any kind of place to stay in security. Really getting very, very worried. And this now was during the heat of the afternoon. The morning had gone by and it was the heat of the afternoon. Across a hill, a dome, a Berber man came with a donkey and a camel. And he saw that I was in trouble. So he brought his donkey and his camel over to the car, didn't say a word to me, which was just, well, because I don't speak Berber, I don't speak Arabic, I didn't speak anything other than, here was a kid from Oregon, what do I know about any of this stuff? He had a homemade hemp rope. He tied it to the axle of the car. He got his donkey and his camel, and he towed me out. I was so grateful, I wanted to offer him something. He absolutely refused. He didn't say anything to me at all, but it's clear that he was not going to accept anything from me. He untied his donkey and the camel from the car, and he was gone. Wordless. But there I was, and by now, the heat of the day had dried up whatever it was that caused the car to stall. So some hours later, as the gate was coming down, we passed through into, there were no lights, nothing available, nothing that you could see except stars and the moon on Christmas Eve night. And we passed through just as the gate was starting to come down. And so it was a memorable day for us because the reason that the gates don't come down, the reason that the Foreign Legion were there because of marauders and all kinds of robbing and other things that had been going on and were still going on in that part of Morocco and the Sahara Desert. So this was one of the more beautiful things that happened. There were so many things that I had the feeling that, who in the world are these people? I've got to understand who the Moroccans are, who Mrs. Abdul Wahab is. I had gone to Morocco believing that everything I had learned as an undergraduate in psychology was true. I left Morocco thinking there probably isn't anything that I learned in psychology that was true. So instead of applying to graduate school in psychology, I realized I've got to understand culture. I've got to understand who people are from their point of view so that I can behave appropriately, because I was fascinated with this. It all started with my dad and then continued on with the deaths that I had experienced and the other kinds of things that in life that happened. So when the year was over, before the year was over, I applied to graduate school in anthropology. I was still interested in psychological things, but then in those days, there was no cross-cultural psychology. It didn't exist. And most of psychology, virtually all of it at that time, this was in the 1950s, was what we learned in psychology came from 18 to 20-year-old college sophomores taking an introductory course in psychology in fulfillment of their undergraduate distribution requirements. And on that, we claimed to be making statements about human behavior. Well, that stuff wasn't true for Mrs. Abdul Wahab. Who was it true for? So I felt like I have to understand this. So I went off to Stanford University, and the first quarter that I was there, I was in a course called Culture and Personality. There was no such thing as psychological anthropology, cross-cultural psychology, didn't exist, and so forth. The only thing that came close to keeping me in a psychological area, but still with an anthropological perspective, was culture and personality. The professor said, look, he had just come from Harvard, and he said, you are going to do a particular kind of study. In those days, it was called cross-cultural survey study. You can take any topic that you want, but you have to use this methodology. And what that methodology amounted to was you would go into the ethnography, the writings of anthropologists, and find some topic that you're interested in, develop a world sample of societies, code your variables, and then run your tests of association. Now, back in those days, we didn't have computers, by the way. Anything that you wanted to do in statistics, you had to do by hand.
Or an abacus.
Well, an abacus, yeah. We didn't even have the little hand calculators. They had, I think, 2 computers in the world at that time. One of them was at Stanford, my home university, and it took up a whole building, about the size of this one, I think. But we weren't allowed to even walk in the building because you had to have a white jacket on, you had to have gloves, you had to have booties, the works. none of this existed. Everything was done by hand in those days. So what topic am I going to choose? Well, one of my very favorite textbooks as an undergraduate had been Coleman's Abnormal Psychology in Everyday Life. It's now, and it's like, last time I heard it, like the 20th edition. But this was the second edition of the book when I'd been an undergraduate. So I found a statement in that book. I still have the book, by the way. It's on my shelf at the office, where it said, rejected children, and then textbooks. If you think about the way textbooks are written, they're always written almost as declarative sentences, so that you kind of read it as if these were eternal truths about what we're like as human beings. Well, I had gone to Morocco as a universalist, thinking, okay, everything I learned in psychology, I've got a handle on it now. I left Morocco saying, no, I don't know any of this stuff. I left Morocco as a relativist. There is no universal. There are no universals in human behavior. Here's somebody who is writing as if there were universals about acceptance and rejection. I'll bet that's not true. So I had a very small sample, 20 societies in this study, and I did a very simple correlations of I don't know, even if I did correlations or just chi-square. Because, as I say, anything that you did in statistics, you had to do by hand. And I wasn't very good yet at statistics. But anyway, what I learned from it when I saw my results, I was stunned. Some of what the author, Coleman, said in the textbook seemed to be true for humans everywhere. In my little sample, all over the world, I looked at, coded for acceptance and rejection. I coded for a set of personality dispositions. The PARC, which later became the parental acceptance rejection questionnaire, and the other one later became the PAC, what we call the PAC, personality assessment questionnaire, looking at things like aggression and so forth as personality characteristics of children and adults. And lo and behold, in those societies, about 25% of the world tends in the normatively, as being culturally appropriate, they tend to reject their children. What we call, intellectually, we call rejection. 75% of the world tends to be warm and loving, more or less. So I had enough rejection in my sample to see what was going on. And as I said, some of what was in there, what the textbook said, seemed to be true, and some of it was not. Didn't hold up. So somehow I had been primed in my life experiences to why this particular topic, I don't know. Why did that fascinate me so much? But it was partly because of my experiences of rejection with Mrs. Abdul-Wahab. I might also add my experiences of rejection. My former wife had been a rejected child, so I learned a great deal about, in fact, a lot of what is now IPARTheory came from my experiences living with her and believing that I could help her change, which I probably did. But anyway, so this is where it started out just as a issue of rejection and acceptance. So in every class, every course in my graduate career where I could possibly fit it in, I would do another study of acceptance and rejection. And I got deeper and deeper into it. And then eventually, I went off, got my PhD, and went off to the University of Connecticut. And there it became the Rejection Acceptance Project for many years until 1980. And that's the first time that we used the label parental acceptance rejection theory. By that time, we had learned enough to be able to label it as a theory. But it all started with Mrs. Abdul-Wahab, my passion to understand who is that woman, what drives her, and all the other experiences of why was I being stoned in this Rift Mountain village? Why did that Berber man come and help me in such a kind, generous way and not say a word about it? What's going on? Who are these people? And that's where eventually what we now know today as IPARTheory, where it comes from.
I think we need to add to the bio that you're also a brilliant storyteller. So, yeah. Now it makes a lot of sense how, when we're talking about IPARTheory now, we're always talking about perceived acceptance and rejection. And the stories that you were just saying speak a lot about that. It's never a black and white kind of thing. There's a lot of misunderstandings that can happen between cultures. In this room, we come from many different countries, and I'm sure we might offend each other sometimes in ways we don't mean, but that's the idea of understanding the perception and the cultural differences. So that's amazing. And I'm glad that you didn't go into engineering. We wouldn't have been meeting in these amazing conferences.
I reject engineering.
Yeah, you did reject engineering, yes. So now, can you tell us a bit more about how you got interested in interpersonal acceptance rejection?
Okay. So how did we get involved in interpersonal acceptance and rejection? Many of you know the theory. In fact, we have a poster outside that talks about PAR theory, parental acceptance rejection theory. That's fine, because that's what it used to be until 2014. When we changed the name from PAR theory, parental acceptance rejection theory, to IPARTheory, interpersonal acceptance rejection theory. And that came about because as time went by,
is your microphone on?
Haldoon, can you hear me?
Sometimes.
Sometimes.
Not all the time.
Okay. All right, I won't put you, Elias, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you, but Hamdun is
Okay. Okay. So the question is, how did it become IPARTheory? What we started finding years ago was that by now, while it was called PAR theory, we had learned that all over the world where children experience themselves to be loved, they tend to psychologically adjust it, for the most part, as measured by the personality assessment questionnaire. There's a cluster of 7 things that tend to happen. We now know, 6 decades later, because I've been doing this now for 6 decades, we now know that you and I and everybody else on the planet, we tend to respond in with a specific set of things happening to us. If we feel that we are unloved, unappreciated as kids by our unwanted, if we feel rejected by our parents, we tend to get anxious, insecure, hostile, aggressive, passive-aggressive, and so forth. Impaired self-esteem, impaired self-adequacy, emotional unresponsiveness, emotional instability, negative worldview, going back to primals. Did I mention 10? Close enough. Anyway, you get the idea. And that happens to all of us. Everybody in here, you can find yourself in this cluster depending on where you feel like what happened to you as a kid growing up. But we also found that in intimate adult relationships, rejecting relationships, individuals in rejecting relationships tend to respond in the same way that rejected children do. But usually not with the same intensity. So by the time you're an adult in an intimate relationship, you have all kinds of other experiences in your life, including with your with your parents. But it turns out that we found out that it isn't, this cluster of things and others isn't just parent-child relationships, it's continuous throughout our lifespan in a whole range of experiences that we have, teachers, coaches, intimate partners, whoever the important people are now or have been, most important people in your life. People, in fact, think about this for yourself. Who is the person or people that are involved in your life now or in the past where your sense of well-being and happiness is dependent on what the quality of that relationship is? If you answer the question, if you can think of a particular person where your sense of happiness and well-being and security is dependent on what goes on, that's for us an attachment figure. We'll be hearing more about attachment figures later on. If you feel rejected by your attachment figure at any point in life, there's a tendency for people everywhere. Again, we find no exceptions in the world. And I can say that with some confidence now because we've been doing this with several 100,000 children and adults on every continent except for the Antarctic for these past 6 decades. And we found so far no exceptions anywhere to the general rule. Some people are able to cope more effectively than others with rejection, yes, but they hurt nonetheless. But they just don't. Some people have the resilience psychologically and whatnot. They don't hurt as much as most rejected kids do that we keep hearing about. So because of all these things that we've learned about how important the warmth and affection, acceptance, rejection phenomenon is throughout our lifespan, then in 2014, we decided to rename it IPARTheory. In fact, I have to give credit to Parminder Pramar because it was at 2014 in, where were we? Moldova. In 2014 in Moldova, it was clear that we needed to change the name of the theory, and I was thinking about IARQ, Interpersonal Acceptance Rejection Theory. Parminder said, "Well, why don't you call it IPARQ? Because that sounds an awful lot like the parental acceptance rejection, so it won't be as confusing." Oh, sounds like a good idea. So we did. Thank you, Parminder, for the idea. So I have to give credit where credit is due. And that's where the label IPARTheory comes from.
Amazing. Now, if we talk a little bit more about rejection, IPARTheory talks about 4 different types of rejection. I want to focus a bit on undifferentiated rejection because that's one that's special. It's one that's not talked about a lot in the literature. It's when there's a perception of rejection, but there is nothing like a behavioral aspect that you can say is there, but it's a perception and a feeling that you get. Can you tell us a bit about how you came up with this construct?
Yes. Okay, in 1975, from 1975 to 1977, I took a leave of absence from the University of Connecticut and went to Washington, D.C., where I was a senior scientist in the Boys Town Center for the Study of Youth Development there. It doesn't exist there anymore. And I had been, people who said, "Ron, all your cross-cultural survey work is interesting, but that doesn't tell me anything about individuals. That's telling me about cultural things. Well, I want to know about individuals." So, okay, that was a point well taken. So I began to develop what most of you know as the PARC, Parental Acceptance Rejection Questionnaire, and all the derivatives from that, and we just heard about that, of course, from Jen. And the companion piece, the PAC, Personality Assessment Questionnaire, that measures 7 of the 10 things that I just mentioned: anger, dependence, and so on, as a result of a rejection. Developed and validated the measures, but there was something left out that I wasn't finding in warmth, affection, hostility, aggression, indifference, neglect. The three scales at that time that I was developing for the park. And then I was asked to come and work with a boy. I was also getting involved a little bit at that time on issues of child abuse that were just beginning to really become very prominent in the United States as a topic. Child abuse and neglect. And I've been working in the school systems a little bit, studying this and whatnot. And somehow this boy came to my attention. He came from a very, very privileged family in Washington, D.C. area. His mom and his dad were both senior executives in various agencies in Washington, D.C. Affluent, very affluent. They had a son who had been thrown out of 3 private schools in 1 year as a behavior problem. And they wonder, what in the world is going on? Why? So if you looking at the family from the outside, they seem to be an ideal. Wow, I wish I had grown up in a family like that. Well, I didn't really, of course, because I love the family that I grew up in. But anyway, you get the idea. They seem to be very, very warm and responsive and loving people. So I was talking to the boy, and I wasn't challenging him the way he has been challenged by some of the other clinicians. Okay, why are you doing that? I was curious. So I sort of approached this boy as kind of a friend. And it turns out that he said, my mom and my dad, this was now, he was going to the back of the classroom every day, chaining himself on the coat rack, yelling, singing Star Spangled Banner during the middle of a math session, doing all kinds of disruptive things in class. So chatting with him, what's going on? Well, he said, in effect, my mom and my dad are so busy with their doing all good things, working, whatnot, they don't have any time for me. I don't care what I have to do. I'm going to make sure they know I exist. He didn't feel like he felt invisible. He always had a babysitter. He always, things like that were happening. He didn't feel like his mom and his dad really paid any attention to him at all. And okay, there you go. Perception. He's perceiving, although his parents would be, in fact they were, I later on told them about my explorations with the boy, and they were shocked. They had no idea. How can that be? We give him everything. And the boy said, yeah, they do. But they give me stuff. I don't want stuff. I don't want Adidas workout clothes and Adidas sneakers and all the good things that you can buy with money. I want my parents, and I don't have them. And his parents, that really rocked them on their heels when they found out that that's what their son was experiencing psychologically, and that's where undifferentiated rejection comes from. It's the perception that this person who is, whatever person that you're thinking about, doesn't really want you, need you, appreciate you, care about you, love you, whatever, without necessarily having any objective indicators. There were no objective indicators that his parents were aggressive or hostile, none that they were neglecting in any usual sense of the word, and so on and so forth. He just did not feel loved, wanted, and that's where it comes from.
Amazing. It's great to get to know the behind the scenes of the constructs and concepts in the theory that we all read about, and to get to know these stories behind them. I want to take you a bit far from the theory, but more about your life and how you do things. So I know that I'm not only speaking about myself, I'm speaking on behalf of everyone in this room when I say that you're a very highly regarded figure in the field of developmental psychology, human development in general. You're very effective, very productive, inspirational, well-received. So can you tell us, especially that this is a talk that's being recorded for scholars and researchers around the world to hear, can you tell us about some of your habits, for example, how do you go about in your priorities, if you have any words that you would like to give to scholars to know?
Yeah, my wife is laughing. I work 7 days a week, not because I have to, because technically I'm retired.
He's not a workaholic.
No. I have a slogan I've written on the whiteboard in my office. 3 essential elements for a good life, or a life well lived. Love, put them in any order that you want to, and think about yourself. Love well, Nancy puts that one first. Work well, I tend to put that one first. And play well, meaning that find things that you get some pleasure out of that isn't just work. But then also, very importantly, keep these 3 things in balance. And that's the hard part. They can get out of whack so easily. The work, the love, the pleasure, something can get out of whack. But for me, I find love in my work. So for me, working with love is the ideal way of working with love, and loving my work is part of what I do. But part of the reason that I work 7 days a week, I try not to go to the office until noon on Saturday and Sunday. But other than that, I'm there until 6 o'clock every night, every day. I just lost my train of thought. What did I just say? What was it?
Do you play on the weekend?
The reason why you work 7 days a week?
Yeah, because the time we get requests every day from all over the world for measures and for information. One of the things I really love to do is to mentor students all over the world. I have a 10-foot shelf of master's and doctoral dissertations. I've never met more than 2 of the people personally. I mentor them, and that gives me such great pleasure. Or all of you, I've communicated probably with most of you at one time or another about what we do and answered questions. But you see, for me, it's a win-win situation. Because not only am I helping you, but you're helping me. Because I am passionate about IPARTheory. And so the work that you do feeds into my passion. I'm addicted. I'm addicted to the stuff.
My last question, and then we can open the floor for questions from the audience. What are your hopes for the future of IPARTheory?
My hopes for the future of IPARTheory is that I'm 89 years old, as you know, is that it will outlast me for generations, and that you all will continue on with your students and your students' students, because I personally have never encountered anything more important in human life that's a better predictor of outcome of all kinds than feeling cared about or not by the people or person who's most important in your life. And so that's what I want to do. I want to have a legacy of promoting that foreverness in what we do, all of us, while we're here in issues of interpersonal acceptance and rejection.
Very, very inspiring. Okay, before we end the workshop, I want to open the floor for any questions. Anyone has any questions for Ron?
Have
left you speechless?
Let me tell about my first personal experience. I had done research, and it was presented, and it was published and stuff. And I still have the corrections on the paper I had prepared. Probably you don't remember. I still have the corrections with your handwriting. I didn't know you then. Then, what?
Read his writing?
Oh yeah, I'm very good at reading. My writing is horrible, so I can read. And then, years later, I decided to go on for sabbatical, and I said, why don't I, talk to Ron? I didn't know him, because I'm working with the theory. So I found a telephone number, and I called. I was thinking that, this would be the university, and I would be getting a number for him, and later on I would contact him. So I call from Turkey, Istanbul, and the man answers, and I said, I would like to get a number for Dr. Ronald Rohner. And he says, that's me. I was speechless because I wasn't prepared. And he says, yes. I don't know if you remember this. And I said, well, I was thinking of going for a sabbatical next year, and I was hoping that perhaps we could make arrangements for that. And he says, I'm Fatosh, and I just remind him. And he said, okay, come. And I said, what? And after I he said, contact me and send me these. I put the telephone, and I don't know if my husband remembers, and I went and I said, he said, yes, I'm going. Is it possible? And I did.
That does sound like him, actually.
And here I am, 23 years later. And 2006 is the first international conference on part theory that we have in Istanbul, Turkey. Yeah. So this is, so 2 years later, you will be doing it in Italy?
2 years from now.
Yes.
2 years later, that will be the 20th year. Yeah.
Wow.
So hope you will all be there. Hope we'll all be there.
Yeah, right. I hope I'm there. I'll be 91 then. So.
You have to.
You're 89-year-old, not old, young.
Yeah.
You change that, 89-year-old, young.
Any other questions or thoughts that you'd like to share? Yeah? You want to say something? It's you?
Hi, I would just like to say that Ron is an inspiration to all of us. And I remember when I was a university student, and as we didn't have any resources then to get scientific papers, I was like, I'll take my chances and write a letter to Dr. Rohner and try to get your article I was interested in, because I wanted to do research on heroin abusers, users and addicts at the time, and I was reading about evidence how parental behavior influences this behavior. But we had epidemic at the time, and there was just after the war, and we had none resources to get articles from the States, for example. And I was writing to Ron, and I didn't expect anything, because a lot of time I was writing to get articles and no one replied. And I was so happy. I remember like it was today when I received your letter and opened it, and there was your article and your letter. And at that point I decided, okay, this is something I want to work at and hopefully get published. I was a student at the time, so I was so happy to do the first research using this theory, and until this day I did I don't know how many research, but it was all because of this letter, and you so much inspired me that I'm very grateful for that to you.
know that you should say, Renata, you should say that her daughter grew up with a part and theory. She was 1 year old in Padova in 2010, and then here you are, here she is, you know. But okay, personally, I have a lot of personal stories that I could mention here, but I prefer that we talk about this outside, you know, after that. Okay, one other thing that I want to say, but this have to do the content, what you say about stories. You, in a certain moment in your presentation here, you opened the chapter of personal stories. And by mentioning that the case of child who there were not any objective indicators about something abusive, something bad on the part of the parents' behavior. But finally, this child was invisible for them. He was feeling invisible for them and existent. And that reminds me a lot of stories of children who, when they go to school, you know, they cannot stand the things that are not invisible, in the sense that they are not able to gain attention by positive means or by usual means, being a good student, etc., or have a very attractive behavior, etc., and how this term that is very largely used by teachers or parents, etc., that she just want to draw attention. They cannot imagine what there is behind this term when they use this simple word, attention. It is not just, just a desire of the child just to. It is something very, very profound and has to do with his whole existence, you know, that I exist for the other, in the eyes and the heart of the other. And that's why many times teachers and other, even practitioners, you know, and parents, of course, say that he just want to draw the attention, you know, but this is something very, very, much deeper, you know, than this, what apparently we mean with this term, you know. That's all that I want to say. There are many other things.
Thank you, everyone, for your comments and for sharing these wonderful stories. Thank you, Ron. It's my pleasure to do this interview with you. You continue to inspire me every day, and I'm sure everyone else in the room has amazing things to say as well. Thank you very, very much.